Liam and Noah stood before the rusting behemoth of an iron engine, the harsh words of the arrogant antique dealer still ringing in their ears. Useless junk, he had called it, laughing at their purchase. But as the brothers would soon discover, the grease-caked iron wasn't just scrap. A hidden hand-polished brass plate buried under decades of sludge was about to change their lives forever. The brothers operated a modest salvage yard on the outskirts of a foggy coastal town, a business they had inherited from their father which was currently hanging by a thread. In a desperate bid to turn their financial situation around, they had attended a liquidation auction for a defunct shipyard. Amidst piles of copper wire and aluminum siding, a massive, singular lot had caught Noah's eye, a gargantuan, 16-cylinder diesel engine, seemingly ripped from the hull of a mid-century freighter. It was covered in layers of marine paint and heavy oil, a sleeping giant of cast iron. The auctioneer had practically begged for an opening bid, and the brothers, sensing the raw value of the metal alone, had purchased it for the price of its weight in scrap. It was a gamble, eating up the last of their operational cash flow, but they calculated that stripping it for parts and melting the block would yield a 20% profit. Before they began the arduous task of cutting the monster apart, they had invited Elias Thorne, the region's most prominent maritime antique dealer, to inspect the acquisition. Thorne was a man known for his expensive suits and his disdain for the working class. He had walked around the engine for less than 2 minutes, tapping it dismissively with his cane. He sneered at the brothers, telling them they had bought a generic, mass-produced commercial rust bucket with zero historical value. He offered them a humiliatingly low sum to haul it away, claiming he was doing them a favor. Liam, fueled by pride and a gut feeling that Thorne was missing something, politely but firmly told the dealer to leave. The dealer's laughter echoed in the empty warehouse as he walked out, predicting their bankruptcy within the month. The insult stung, but it also lit a fire under the brothers. They weren't just going to scrap this engine. They were going to dismantle it with surgical precision to squeeze every cent of value out of it, just to prove Thorne wrong. Hey guys! We are taking a quick break from this heavy lifting because we have a huge announcement. We are incredibly close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, and we need your help to smash that goal. If you are enjoying the mystery of this salvage, please hit that like button and subscribe right now. It helps us keep these stories coming. Also, we want to know our community better. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. And if you really want to support the channel, check out the Super Thanks button below. Now, let's get back to the engine room. The work began the following morning under the cold, gray light of the warehouse. The engine was truly massive, standing nearly 10 feet tall, a testament to the industrial engineering of a bygone era. The first step was degreasing. The brothers donned their heavy protective gear and began applying industrial solvent to the exterior. The decades of accumulated oil, maritime grime, and hardened salt were stubborn, forming a black shell around the machinery. As they worked, the smell of chemical cleaner mixed with the scent of old diesel. They worked methodically, moving from the upper valve covers down toward the massive crankcase. As the layers of filth washed away, the sheer quality of the casting began to reveal itself. This wasn't the rough, pitted iron of a cheap commercial transport. The metal was smooth, high-grade, and the bolts were machined with a precision that seemed excessive for a simple cargo hauler. Noah was working on the side of the engine block, scrubbing a rectangular section near the mounting brackets. It was an odd place for a detail, usually where a manufacturer would stamp a serial number. As his wire brush scraped against the surface, the sound changed from the dull scratch of iron to a higher-pitched ring. He paused, frowning. He sprayed more solvent on the area and wiped it with a clean rag. Beneath the black sludge, a glint of gold broke through the darkness. It wasn't iron, and it wasn't steel. It was a heavy, bolted-on plate made of solid brass. Liam came over to help, bringing a finer polishing cloth. Together, they carefully removed the remaining gunk. The plate was not a standard factory stamp. It was ornate, with engraved lettering rather than stamped characters. As the final smear of grease was wiped away, the brothers stared in silence. The plate bore the crest of a naval manufacturer that had ceased to exist before World War II, and below it, the words Experimental Prototype, Class A 1934. But what caught their breath was the ship name engraved at the bottom, a name that was rumored to have carried a secret cargo before vanishing from the records. The dealer, Thorne, hadn't seen this because he hadn't looked past the dirt. He saw scrap, they saw a mystery. The engine wasn't from a cargo ship, it was the heart of a ghost. The discovery of the brass plate shifted the atmosphere in the salvage yard from one of grueling labor to electrified mystery. Liam and Noah immediately stopped the cleaning process, realizing they were potentially destroying historical evidence with every scrape of the wire brush. They carefully photographed the engraving, focusing on the experimental prototype designation and the obscure 1934 date. They retreated to their small, cluttered office, a room stacked high with dusty maritime encyclopedias and old naval registers that their father had collected over 40 years. They needed to understand what they were looking at before they dared to touch the engine again. The name on the plate, Project Acheron, did not appear in the standard commercial registries, which explained why Thorne, the arrogant dealer, had dismissed it. He had looked for standard models. This was a ghost. After hours of cross-referencing obscure footnotes in a frayed volume regarding pre-war naval engineering, Noah found it. Project Acheron was a short-lived, classified initiative commissioned by a private consortium of European industrialists fearing the onset of war. They had commissioned a series of high-speed, heavy-load engines designed not for warships, but for blockade runners, vessels built to move high-value assets fast and quietly across hostile waters. The entry noted that only 3 such engines were ever cast before the foundry was destroyed in an accidental fire in 1935. 2 were accounted for and scrapped in the 1950s. The third, intended for a vessel named the Iron Duke, had vanished from shipping manifests entirely. The brothers looked at each other, the realization settling in. They weren't scrapping a generic trawler engine. They were looking at the lost heart of the Iron Duke. A sudden wave of paranoia washed over them. If Thorne, the dealer, realized his mistake, he would be back. He had the capital and the legal connections to make their lives difficult, perhaps claiming the sale was invalid due to an error in the listing. They locked the heavy corrugated doors of the warehouse, shutting out the world. They returned to the engine, but now they looked at it with the eyes of forensic investigators rather than scrappers. The schematics they found for similar engines of that era showed a standard V16 configuration with a massive central oil sump. However, as Liam circled the beast, tapping the cast iron block with a small ball-peen hammer, the acoustic feedback was inconsistent. The front 8 cylinders rang with the deep, hollow thud of empty combustion chambers. But when he tapped the rear section of the block, specifically around the housing for cylinders 15 and 16, the sound changed. It was a dull, dense thud, lacking the reverberation of a hollow space. It sounded solid, or at least, packed. The brothers consulted the diagrams again. There should have been empty space there for the massive pistons to travel. The fact that it sounded solid suggested a modification that wasn't in any manual. They realized that the Iron Duke hadn't just been a fast ship, the ship itself was likely a diversion. The engine was the container. They focused their efforts on the crankcase access door on the starboard side, a heavy slab of iron held in place by 20 rusted bolts. If there was a secret hidden inside the block, this was the way in. They applied penetrating oil to the seized bolts, waiting impatiently for the chemistry to work. The tension in the room was palpable. The silence was only broken by the humming of the shop lights and their own breathing. When they finally applied the torque wrench to the first bolt, it groaned in protest, a screech of metal on metal that sounded like a scream. One by one, fighting 50 years of corrosion, they wrestled the bolts free. Their knuckles were bloody and their muscles ached, but the adrenaline kept them moving. With the final bolt removed, they used a pry bar to crack the seal of the heavy access door. A hiss of escaping air, stale, pressurized air from 1934, greeted them. This confirmed the chamber had been hermetically sealed and never opened since the day it was bolted shut. They pulled the heavy iron plate away, setting it on the concrete floor with a clang. They grabbed their high-powered inspection lights and aimed the beams into the dark, oily belly of the engine. What they saw stopped them cold. The internal anatomy of the engine was completely wrong. The crankshaft, the massive steel spine that should have run the full length of the block, had been shortened. The rear section of the engine, where cylinders 15 and 16 should have been connected, was missing its mechanical guts entirely. Instead of connecting rods and pistons, the space had been welded shut with a secondary steel wall, creating a smooth, box-like compartment nestled deep within the protective cast iron shell of the engine block. It was a safe, integrated into the very structure of the ship's propulsion, impossible to detect unless the engine was taken apart. The false wall had a circular locking mechanism, similar to a submarine hatch but smaller, covered in a thick layer of cosmoline grease to prevent rust. The engineering was exquisite. Whoever had built this wanted to ensure that even if the ship sank, the contents of this chamber would survive the pressure of the deep ocean. Noah wiped away the grease from the lock. It didn't require a key. It required a specific mechanical sequence of rotations, like a vault combination. But the combination wasn't written anywhere. They were staring at a locked safe inside a locked engine, and the only man who knew the code had likely been dead for decades. However, upon closer inspection, Liam noticed faint scratch marks near the dial, tiny, frantic etchings made with a sharp object, barely visible to the naked eye. It looked like someone, perhaps the captain or the engineer, had scratched a series of numbers into the steel in a moment of desperation. Liam leaned in closer, his breath held tight in his chest, using a jeweler's loupe to magnify the frantic scratches etched into the steel next to the dial. The markings were crude, clearly made in a hurry with a hardened steel punch or perhaps the tip of a file. Under the magnification, the chaos resolved into a sequence. It wasn't just random damage. It was a desperate message left by a man who knew he might never return to this engine room. The scratches formed 3 distinct clusters of tally marks. 4 lines, then a gap, 12 lines, and finally 9 lines. The combination was 4-12-9. It was a simple sequence, likely chosen for speed rather than complexity, a fail-safe for a captain under duress. Noah held the heavy inspection light steady, his hands trembling slightly, casting deep shadows against the curved metal of the crankcase interior. Liam reached out, his gloved fingers gripping the cold, greasy dial. He turned it clockwise to 4. A solid mechanical clack echoed inside the block, a sound that felt loud in the silent warehouse. He reversed direction, spinning the dial counterclockwise to 12. The internal tumblers groaned, the lubricant inside having turned to a sticky paste over 80 years, but they moved. Finally, he turned it clockwise to 9. There was a pause, a moment where time seemed to suspend, and then a heavy, resonant thunk vibrated through the engine block. The locking bolts had retracted. With a grunt of effort, Liam pulled on the circular handle. The seal, made of a pre-war rubber compound and lead gasket, fought them for a moment before giving way with a sharp hiss of equalization. The heavy steel door swung open on concealed hinges. The brothers peered inside, expecting to see rust or perhaps empty space. Instead, they saw the gleam of polished wood. The compartment was lined with fitted mahogany, a stark and bizarre contrast to the filthy, industrial iron surrounding it. It was like finding a piece of a luxury yacht embedded in the heart of a workhorse. Inside this small, velvet-lined cavity sat 2 objects, a heavy, wax-sealed leather satchel and a rectangular metal case made of dull, gray lead. Noah reached in first, carefully extracting the lead case. It was incredibly heavy for its size, suggesting dense contents. He set it on the concrete floor, away from the engine. Liam followed, pulling out the leather satchel, which was brittle and cracked with age but still intact. They decided to open the lead case first. It had no lock, only a series of heavy clasps. They popped them open and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in individual felt cutouts, were 6 heavy bars wrapped in oil paper. Liam unwrapped one. It wasn't gold. The metal was silvery white, far brighter than silver and heavier than lead. It was platinum. Stamped into the face of the ingot was the mark of a defunct European refinery and a purity rating of .999. In the 1930s, platinum was a critical strategic material, essential for high-performance engine parts and chemical production, often more valuable than gold during wartime preparations. These 6 bars alone were worth a small fortune, easily paying for the engine and the entire salvage yard. But the satchel held the true context of the find. They carefully cut the wax seal on the leather bag. Inside were documents, brittle, yellowed papers protected by the leather. There were navigation charts for the Iron Duke, marked with a route that avoided all standard shipping lanes, hugging the coastlines in dangerous waters. But beneath the charts was a personal journal belonging to the ship's chief engineer, a man named Alexander Vore. Noah began to read the entries aloud, his voice echoing in the large room. The entries described a desperate flight from a closing geopolitical noose in 1934. The platinum wasn't stolen. It was the liquidated assets of the engineering firm that had designed the engine, the very company that Thorne, the dealer, had mocked. The owners were fleeing persecution and had melted their wealth into these bars, hiding them in the one place they knew no customs inspector would ever check, inside the functioning crankcase of their prototype engine. The journal revealed that the Iron Duke never made its ocean crossing. It had been sabotaged in port, the engine seized as scrap by corrupt officials who never knew that the true value wasn't the ship, but the heart of the engine itself. The engineer had scratched the code in a final act of hope, praying he could one day return to buy back the scrap engine. He never did. The brothers sat in silence, surrounded by the smell of oil and the weight of history. They had recovered a fortune in platinum, but they had also uncovered a tragedy. They were no longer just salvaging metal, they were the custodians of a lost legacy. The euphoria of the find was intoxicating. They began to calculate the value. The platinum alone was worth hundreds of thousands in raw material, but as historical artifacts, combined with the provenance of the journal and the unique engine, the value was astronomical. They were rich. Suddenly, the sound of gravel crunching outside the warehouse shattered the moment. Tires were rolling slowly over the stones. Heavy, slow tires. Then, the distinct slam of a luxury car door. A heavy silence followed, then the rattle of the main warehouse door handle. Someone was trying to get in. "Hello? Anyone home?" The voice was muffled but unmistakable. It was Thorne. Panic surged through the brothers. Why was he back? Had he realized the error? If he saw the open engine, the platinum, or the journal, he could tie the discovery up in legal battles for years, claiming he had sold the scrap metal, but not the contents, or that the sale was based on a fraudulent description. They had to hide everything, and fast. Liam grabbed the platinum bars and shoved them back into the lead case, sliding it under a pile of greasy tarps. Noah grabbed the satchel and ran to the office, locking it in their rusty floor safe. "Just a minute," Liam yelled, trying to sound casual, wiping the sweat and grease from his forehead. He signaled Noah to close the engine compartment. They shoved the heavy iron access plate back onto the block, covering the open safe, but they didn't have time to bolt it shut. They just leaned it in place and draped a dirty rag over the seam. Liam walked to the small pedestrian door and unlocked it. Thorne stood there, wearing a pristine beige trench coat that looked ridiculous in the industrial yard. He wasn't smiling. His eyes darted past Liam, scanning the warehouse, trying to see the engine. "I think I may have been too hasty," Thorne said, his voice smooth but his eyes cold. "I've been reviewing my inventory lists. There was a mix-up with the paperwork. That engine, it wasn't supposed to be in the liquidation lot. I'm afraid I'm going to need to refund your money and take it back. I'll add a 10% inconvenience fee, of course." He stepped forward, trying to push past Liam. Thorne knew. Somehow he knew. Liam stood his ground in the doorway, his frame filling the gap between the rusted jamb and the heavy steel door. He didn't move, despite Thorne's attempt to breeze past him. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Thorn's eyes were darting over Liam's shoulder, trying to peer into the gloom of the warehouse, specifically towards the engine block where the access panel was hastily propped up, unbolted. The antique dealer's sudden reappearance wasn't a coincidence. His sudden desire to refund a scrap sale screamed of ulterior motives. Thorn had done his homework after leaving the yard earlier, likely realizing that the junk he had mocked was the only surviving relic of the Iron Duke. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thorn," Liam said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering in his chest. "But the sale is final. We have the receipt, and the title has transferred. The engine is ours." He crossed his arms, his grease-stained coveralls a sharp contrast to Thorn's immaculate coat. Thorn's pleasant facade cracked. He stopped trying to look around and locked eyes with Liam. "Don't be foolish, son. You bought scrap iron. If there has been administrative error regarding the inventory of a historical asset, the courts can tie up your little operation here for years. I am offering you a profit. Take the money, give me the engine, and avoid the bankruptcy that fighting me will guarantee." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "I know what that engine is. And I know you two don't have the resources to restore it. You're going to cut it up for melt value, destroying history. I won't let that happen." It was a clever pivot, painting himself as the protector of history rather than a greedy opportunist. But then, Thorn's gaze drifted past Liam again, and this time he saw it. The shop light was still angled towards the side of the block, illuminating the rectangular patch where the brothers had scrubbed away the grime. The brass builder's plate shone like a beacon in the dark room. Thorn's eyes widened, and a flicker of genuine greed replaced his faux concern. He saw the brass. He knew they had found the ID plate. "You cleaned it," Thorn hissed, his politeness evaporating entirely. "You know." "We know it's our engine," Noah's voice came from behind Liam. Noah had stepped out of the shadows, holding a large wrench, not aggressively, but with clear intent. "Please leave our property, Mr. Thorn, or we call the police for trespassing." Thorn stared at them for a long, uncomfortable moment, calculating his odds. He was outnumbered and on private property. He sneered, buttoning his coat. "Enjoy it for the night, boys. I'll have an injunction filed by morning. That engine is stolen property from the 1930s, and I represent the estate of the original insurers. You won't touch a bolt on it without a lawyer present." He turned on his heel and marched back to his luxury sedan, tires spinning on the loose gravel as he sped away. The moment the taillights disappeared, the brothers scrambled. The threat of an injunction was real. If Thorn returned with a court order, the authorities would seize the engine and everything inside it. They would find the hidden compartment, the platinum, and the journal. The brothers would lose everything, potentially facing criminal charges if Thorn spun the narrative that they were concealing assets. "We have to move the platinum," Noah said, rushing to the pile of tarps where they had hidden the lead case. "If they raid us tomorrow, this place needs to be clean." "No," Liam said, his mind racing. "Moving the platinum makes us look like thieves if we get caught. We need to prove we own it. The journal. Check the journal again. Thorn said he represents the insurers. That means he thinks the engine was stolen from the original owners. But the journal said the owners hid the assets themselves." They ran back to the office and opened the safe, pulling out the fragile leather-bound book. They treated the pages with surgical care, scanning the handwritten Russian and English entries of the engineer Alexander Vore. They looked for anything that resembled a legal transfer. As Liam turned the back cover, he felt something stiff beneath the leather lining. The binding was unusually thick. "Hand me the X-Acto knife," Liam muttered. With precise movements, he sliced along the inner seam of the journal's back cover. The leather peeled away to reveal a hidden pocket containing a single, folded document on thick, vellum paper. It was a chaotic mix of stamps and wax seals. It was a bearer bond of title and a transfer of salvage rights, dated 1934, signed by the three heads of the consortium and witnessed by a notary in neutral territory. The document explicitly stated that in the event of the Iron Duke's sabotage or loss, the ownership of the vessel and all internal machinery and cargo contained therein was transferred irrevocably to the bearer of this instrument, intended for the chief engineer Vore to use to restart the company in America. Since Vore had died or fled without retrieving it, the title had remained with the engine. By finding the document, Liam and Noah weren't just scrap dealers who found money. They were the legal owners of the legacy. The document was a poison pill for anyone like Thorne claiming insurance rights. The original owners had legally signed away the insurance claim to the bearer of the note to avoid seizure by the regime they were fleeing. But there was one more thing. Clipped to the title deed was a small, hand-drawn schematic of the engine block. It pointed to the dummy cylinders, 15 and 16, but it also pointed to a second location, the hollow crankshaft itself. The note next to it read, "The decoy is the chamber. The future is in the spine." The brothers looked at each other, stunned. The platinum bars they had found in the false wall were just the decoy. The real treasure wasn't the precious metal. It was whatever was hidden inside the hollow crankshaft. Thorne was fighting for the engine because he likely knew about the platinum, thinking that was the main prize. He didn't know about the crankshaft. The brothers had until morning to unlock the second secret before the lawyers arrived. They grabbed their tools and ran back to the engine. They had to pull the massive crankshaft out, a task that usually took a crane and a team of 5, and they had to do it alone, tonight. The warehouse became a scene of desperate, high-stakes industrial surgery. Liam and Noah had no crane, no crew, and no time. They rigged a dangerous improvised gantry using heavy-duty towing chains thrown over the steel rafters of the building, connecting them to a manual chain hoist. The crankshaft of the V16 engine was a solid spine of forged steel, weighing nearly a ton. To remove it without dismantling the entire block required perfect alignment and brute force. For 6 hours, they labored in a sweat-drenched rhythm. Loosen the main bearing caps, secure the chains, heave on the hoist, and pray the rafters didn't buckle. At 4 a.m., with a groan of metal that echoed like a dying beast, the massive crankshaft broke free from its oil suction seal. Swinging dangerously in the air, the steel log was slowly guided out of the engine block and lowered onto a bed of wooden pallets. The brothers were exhausted, their hands raw and shaking, but they couldn't stop. They moved to the flywheel end of the shaft. According to the schematic found in the journal, the spine was hollowed out from this end. Noah used a breaker bar to unscrew a massive reverse-threaded cap that looked like a standard counterweight. It fought them, seized by decades of rust, but finally gave way with a sharp crack. As they unscrewed the cap, a thick, viscous amber fluid drained out, preservative oil. Once it cleared, they shone their light into the hollow bore of the shaft. It wasn't empty. Tightly packed inside were 3 long, cylindrical metal tubes, sealed with wax and lead. They pulled the first one out. It was heavy. Noah carefully sliced the seal and popped the cap. He tipped the tube, and a cascade of small, glittering stones spilled onto the oil-stained rag on the floor. They weren't jewelry diamonds. They were uncut, industrial-grade diamonds, thousands of them. In the 1930s, these were the hardest substance on Earth, essential for manufacturing the tools of war and industry. The future the engineer wrote about was the ability to manufacture. But in today's market, the sheer volume of high-grade raw stones was a fortune. The second tube contained rolled bundles of high-value Swiss bearer bonds, dated 1934, with coupons attached that had never been cashed. These were financial instruments designed to hold value through the collapse of governments. The third tube contained the technical patents for the engine itself, blueprints for a high-efficiency fuel injection system that was decades ahead of its time. The sun was just beginning to streak through the dirty warehouse windows when the sound of multiple vehicles arriving outside signaled the end of their privacy. A heavy pounding on the metal door followed. "Police! Open up!" Liam calmly wiped his hands on a rag. picked up the leather journal containing the Vor deed, and walked to the door. He unlocked it to reveal a chaotic scene. Thorne stood there, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies and a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. Thorne looked triumphant, a predatory grin plastered on his face. "I told you, boys," Thorne sneered, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He pointed a manicured finger at the dismantled engine. "Look at this. Destruction of historical property. Deputies, secure this site. These men are in possession of stolen assets belonging to the Maritime Insurance Trust." The lawyer stepped forward, holding a court order. "We have an injunction freezing all assets related to the salvage of the vessel formerly known as the Iron Duke or its components." Noah stepped out from behind the engine block. He wasn't holding a wrench this time. He was holding the bearer bond of title document they had found hidden in the journal. He walked past Thorne and handed the paper directly to the lead deputy, ignoring the lawyer entirely. "Officer," Noah said calmly, "Mr. Thorne is claiming rights based on an insurance default from 1935. However, this document proves that the original owners legally transferred the title of the engine and all its internal contents to the bearer of this note before the ship was listed as a loss. The insurance claim is void because the asset was never legally lost. It was privately transferred. We are the bearers. We own the engine, the platinum, and everything else." The deputy, a gruff man who knew the brothers and disliked out-of-town lawyers, took the document. He read it, squinting at the official seals and the notary stamps. He looked at the lawyer, then at the document again. He handed it to Thorne's lawyer. "You might want to read that, counselor. Looks like a clean chain of custody to me." The lawyer scanned the document, his face draining of color. He whispered something to Thorne. Thorne's arrogance collapsed instantly. "That's impossible," he sputtered. "That's a forgery." "It's authenticated by the International Maritime Bureau stamp," Noah said, pointing to the seal. "And we have the captain's journal to back it up. You bought the hull, Mr. Thorne, but the engine was a separate legal entity. And you sold it to us. No returns." Thorne looked at the dismantled engine, then at the brothers. He realized he had held the deed to a fortune in his hands and sold it for scrap iron because he was too arrogant to scrape off a little grease. The deputies asked Thorne and his lawyer to leave the property. As Thorne walked away, he looked like a man who had physically aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The aftermath was life-changing. The platinum bars and the industrial diamonds were appraised at a combined value of over $14 million. The Swiss bonds, after a lengthy legal process with the banks, yielded another $4 million in accrued interest. The junk engine had made Liam and Noah some of the wealthiest men in the state. But they didn't retire to a beach. They were salvagers at heart. They used the money to completely modernize their yard, buying the best equipment and hiring a full crew. They kept the engine block of the Iron Duke. They hired specialists to clean and restore it, polishing the brass plate that had started it all until it shone like gold. They mounted the massive engine in the lobby of their new headquarters, a museum-quality centerpiece. The hollow crankshaft and the false wall were left open, displayed with replicas of the platinum and diamonds, telling the story of the engineer who bet on the future. The brothers became legends in the salvage community, known as the men who looked deeper than the rust. They proved that in the world of salvage, the true value isn't in what you see on the surface, but in the secrets hidden underneath. And as for Thorne? He went out of business 6 months later, his reputation destroyed by the story of the fortune he gave away.